Unusual fencing rules you didn't know about in Australia. When most people think of Australia, they imagine kangaroos hopping around, the Sydney Opera House shining by the harbour, or long sunny beaches. But there's another side of life in Australia that newcomers and even locals sometimes find puzzling: fencing rules. Yes, we're talking about those backyard and boundary fences between properties. Now, before you click away thinking this sounds boring, stick with me. Because fencing in Australia is not just about keeping the dog inside or stopping your neighbor's cat from sneaking into your garden. It's full of rules, responsibilities, and sometimes downright weird situations that can leave people scratching their heads. In this video, we're going to explore some of the weird fencing rules in Australia that you may not know about. Whether you're a homeowner, a renter, or just curious about how neighborly disputes can turn into legal dramas, you'll find this both informative and entertaining. And hey, if you've ever had a funny or frustrating fencing experience in Australia, make sure you comment below and share your story. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because we've got more surprising and practical videos about life in Australia coming your way. Right, let's dive in. First things first, let's talk about the basics. In Australia, fencing laws are often decided at the state or territory level. That means what applies in Victoria might not apply in Queensland or Western Australia. On top of that, local councils can also have their own guidelines. Sounds confusing already, right? But it gets better. One of the weirdest things is that fencing is considered a shared responsibility between neighbors. That means if you and your neighbor share a boundary fence, you're usually both responsible for the cost of building or repairing it. Sounds fair, but here's where it gets tricky. What if your neighbor doesn't want to pay? Or worse, what if they want to build a 6-foot-tall fortress while you just want a simple timber fence? Suddenly, you've got a legal drama on your hands. Here's another strange rule. In many states, if you want to replace or build a fence, you actually have to serve your neighbor a notice to fence. Yes, it's a formal letter, almost like serving a legal notice. It sounds more dramatic than it really is, but it's still funny to imagine. Dear neighbor, please take notice that our innocent little fence has now become a serious matter of law. And the rules don't stop there. The type of fence you can build depends on your area. In some residential zones, there are limits on how high your fence can be. For example, front yard fences are often limited to around 1.2 meters high, while backyard fences can usually go up to about 2 meters. So, if you were planning to build a giant Great Wall of Australia around your house, sorry, you're probably breaking council rules. Now let's get into some real weird but true scenarios. Did you know that if a tree falls on your shared fence, you might not be automatically responsible for fixing it even if the tree was in your yard? Responsibility can depend on whether the tree fell due to natural causes, neglect, or storm damage. Imagine explaining that one to your insurance company. No, I didn't push the tree, it fell on its own. Honestly. Then there's the whole thing about color and materials. Some states have good neighbor fencing laws, which basically mean the fence has to look the same on both sides. No cheating by giving your neighbor the ugly backside of the timber fence while you keep the pretty side. Both sides should look fair. This is to avoid neighbor wars where one side feels they got the rough end of the deal. Speaking of neighbor wars, fencing disputes are actually one of the most common reasons people end up in local courts or tribunals in Australia. Picture this. 2 grown adults spending months fighting over who should pay $300 for a new section of fence. It sounds ridiculous, but it happens more often than you think. In fact, there are entire legal guides published just to help Australians deal with fencing fights. Another oddity is the rule about swimming pools and fences. If you have a pool in your backyard, you must have a fence around it that meets very strict safety standards. And trust me, these rules are serious business. The fence must be at least 1.2 meters high, it must have self-closing gates, and the gap at the bottom can't be too big. Why? Because children's safety is priority number one. Failing to follow pool fencing laws can land you with huge fines, even if nobody gets hurt. Imagine telling your Sri Lankan relatives, "Yes, I got fined because my pool gate wasn't self-latching." They'd think you were joking, but in Australia that's reality. Now let's talk about animals. In rural Australia, fencing rules can get even weirder. Farmers are often required to build fences that stop their livestock from escaping. That sounds obvious, but the rules about what type of fence is suitable can be very specific. For example, in some areas, you need special fencing if you're keeping goats, because goats are basically escape artists. They'll climb, jump, or squeeze through anything. Sheep, on the other hand, just need lower fences because they're not as ambitious. Cattle require stronger fences, and if you live in areas with wild kangaroos, you may even need extra protection to stop them from knocking down your fences. And then there's the funny situation with boundary fencing in new estates. If you've ever bought land in a new housing development, you may be surprised that the developer has rules about what kind of fence you can build. Some insist on uniform styles, heights, or even colors so the neighborhood looks neat and tidy. On paper it sounds fine, but imagine everyone in the street having the exact same beige fence. It's like living in a suburban army camp. Here's another curveball. Did you know that in some cases, you can be fined for having a fence that's too high because it blocks your neighbor's sunlight? Yes, sunlight access is a protected thing in some council areas. So you may have thought building a taller fence will give you privacy, but instead, you might just land yourself in hot water with the council. But one of the strangest fence-related issues is what happens when the fence is built in the wrong place. Boundary disputes are surprisingly common in Australia. Sometimes, after years of living peacefully, neighbors discover that their fence is actually sitting on the wrong line. Maybe it's a few centimeters into the other person's property. Suddenly, lawyers get involved and what was once a friendly backyard barbecue turns into, "See you in court, mate." And if you think fencing disputes only happen in the suburbs or the bush, think again. Even in the city, people argue about fences around car parks, driveways, and even tiny garden strips. Australians love fairness and rules, but sometimes those rules create situations that look more like comedy than common sense. So, what's the takeaway from all these weird fencing rules? The main lesson is, if you're planning to build, repair, or replace a fence in Australia, don't just grab a hammer and start. Talk to your neighbor, check your local council guidelines, and if needed, serve that fancy notice to fence. It may sound formal, but it can save you a lot of headaches later. And remember, fences aren't just about wood, metal, or concrete. They're about relationships. A fence can either create peace between neighbors or spark a long-lasting war. Handle it wisely, and you'll avoid being one of those people who ends up on the evening news over a fence fight. So, those are some of the weird, wonderful, and sometimes frustrating fencing rules in Australia. Some of them make perfect sense while others feel like they came straight out of a comedy script. But they all show one thing: living in Australia means respecting not just the land, but also the invisible lines that divide it. If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own fencing story in the comments below. I'd love to know if you've ever had a strange fence experience, whether it's in Australia or back in Sri Lanka.